Let me tell you something the Galactic Council doesn't want you to know. They scrubbed it from the public archives, reclassified it under 17 different security seals. There are entire species out there, species that have been sailing the void between stars for longer than humanity has had written language, who refused to say the name Cale Doran in open communication channels, not because he was a warlord, not because he commanded fleets, not because he held some political office or carried some ancient weapon or possessed some rare genetic gift that made him special among his own kind. No, they are afraid of Cale Doran because of what he did after they killed his dog. That's it, that's the whole reason. And if you think that sounds small, if you think that sounds like I'm exaggerating for effect, then you don't understand humans yet. You don't understand what we are, what we've always been. What every other civilization in this galaxy learned the hard way, one burned ship at a time. We are the species that crossed an ocean in wooden boats because we were curious. We are the species that looked at a disease killing millions and decided to inject ourselves with it on purpose to figure out how to stop it. We are the species that, when something threatens what we love, does not calculate the odds, does not assess the strategic viability, does not wait for permission from any council, any authority, any god. We just move. And the Volkai Syndicate, the most feared pirate confederation in the outer reaches, found that out too late. This is the story of Cale Doran and Patches. And what happened to the Volkai after they made the worst mistake any living being has ever made in the recorded history of this galaxy. Sit down. This takes a while. Set up the station was called Meridian's Cradle, and it hung in the empty space between the Cashin Drift and the outer shipping lanes like a rusted old lantern nobody had bothered to turn off. It wasn't beautiful. Let's get that out of the way early. Nobody ever looked at Meridian's Cradle and thought gorgeous. The original colonial platform had been built by the Teshari Collective about 300 years ago as a fuel depot and trade waypoint. And over the centuries, it had accumulated additions and repairs and expansions, the way a shipwreck accumulates barnacles, without any real plan, just layers of necessity piled on top of layers of desperation. By the time Cale Doran arrived with his survey vessel, the station was a maze of interconnected habitation rings, pressurized markets, docking corridors that went nowhere, and maintenance shafts that contained entire sub-economies of creatures who preferred to live in the dark. There were 17 languages spoken fluently within its walls, and at least 43 more spoken badly. You could buy anything in Meridian's Cradle. Cargo manifests, travel permits, black market transit chips, medicines the Galactic Council had restricted, cultural artifacts that were technically illegal to own, but nobody was going to say anything as long as the credits moved quietly. It smelled, if you want to know the truth. Every section of it smelled different. The Teshari district smelled like the chemical brine they used in their food preparation. The human quarters smelled like coffee and machine oil, and something faintly biological that humans generated just by existing in large groups. The market corridors near the outer docking rings smelled like recycled atmosphere, and whatever cargo had leaked from the last 100 ships to pass through. Cale had been docked at Meridian's Cradle for 3 weeks by the time the Volkai came. He was doing survey work, legitimate, boring, exactly the kind of job that paid just enough to keep a single crew vessel running without any real profit left over. The Cashin Drift was a debris field stretching across nearly 40,000 kilometers of space, the remnants of a planetary collision that had happened before humans had fire, and there were rumors, always rumors, that pre-collapse Teshari relics were buried in the dense intersections. Survey companies paid modestly for credible navigation data. It wasn't glamorous work. It was the kind of work you took when you were between contracts and needed to keep moving. Cale was 34 years old. He had dark hair that was starting to go gray at the temples, which surprised him every time he caught his reflection in a viewport because he didn't feel that old. He had the kind of face that looked tired even when he was well rested, not unhappy, just lived in, like someone who had seen enough of the galaxy to know it wasn't going to surprise him much anymore. He'd served in the Colonial Survey Corps for 8 years, done 2 years of contract work for a private cartography firm, and then gone independent when the firm had been absorbed by a Galactic Trade Authority subsidiary, and the new management had decided that human employees were a liability they didn't need. He wasn't bitter about it. Not exactly. He'd packed his gear, signed his release papers, taken his survey vessel, the Constant Meridian, which he'd been making payments on for 6 years and technically didn't fully own yet, and pointed it toward the outer reaches, which was what humans called the portions of the galaxy that the major civilizations hadn't fully settled yet. The wild spaces. The unmapped edges. There was plenty of work out there if you didn't mind the quiet. Cale didn't mind the quiet. He had Patches. Patches was a dog. I want you to understand something about that before we go any further. In the year 2387, there were approximately 4 million humans living and working in deep space, scattered across stations, ships, research outposts, and colonial settlements throughout the galaxy. Most of them had adapted to alien companionship in various ways. Some kept fish in sealed tanks, decorative things, mostly small moving shapes of color behind glass. Some had formed genuine friendships with alien crew members. A few had even managed cross-species bonds that the xenobiologists found fascinating and slightly uncomfortable to study. But a meaningful number of them, maybe 30%, the surveys suggested, had brought Earth animals with them. Cats mostly. Cats were practical. They didn't take up much space. They managed their own bathroom situations with minimal infrastructure, and they had a self-sufficiency that translated well to the rhythms of deep space life. Dogs were rarer because dogs required more from you. More space, more time, more emotional engagement. A dog was a commitment in a way a cat wasn't, and deep space work tended to attract people who were already overcommitted to the work itself. But Cale had Patches. Patches was, if you were being technical about it, a mongrel. Some kind of Australian shepherd mix, the shelter had said, though the shelter had also clearly been guessing. She was medium-sized, maybe 22 kilograms, with a coat that was black and white and brown in a pattern that looked like someone had been painting her and kept changing their mind. She had one blue eye and one brown eye, which gave her a slightly otherworldly look that Cale had always found charming. She had a square jaw and big paws and a tail that didn't wag so much as rotate, a full propeller spin of enthusiasm that she deployed every time Cale walked into any room she was in. He'd gotten her 7 years ago, when he was still working for the cartography firm and living in a small apartment on Kepler Station. She'd been 4 months old at the time, a wriggling chaos creature who had immediately located every sock in his apartment and relocated them to a pile under his bunk. The shelter had named her Constellation, which Cale had found both pretentious and appropriate for a creature he was planning to take into space. He'd shortened it to Connie first, then to something else entirely after she'd come back from her first grooming appointment at the station's pet services kiosk looking like a different dog entirely, white patches prominent, face freshly clean. Patches, he'd said, looking at her. You look like a Patches. She'd wagged her tail so hard she'd fallen over. The name stuck. 7 years is a long time to share a small space with another living thing. Cale knew Patches the way you know your own heartbeat, not consciously, not analytically, just as a constant background presence that you only notice when it changes. He knew which of her sleeping positions meant she was fully out versus which meant she was half alert to sounds in the corridor. He knew she didn't like the recycled air smell that came from old stations, but would endure it without complaint as long as she had her blanket in the forward cabin. He knew she had learned, over years of watching Cale navigate space traffic and docking procedures and tense conversations with clients, to read his tension levels with an accuracy that exceeded most of his human colleagues. When Cale was stressed, Patches put her head on his knee, not intrusively, not demanding, just there. A warm weight that said, I'm here. Whatever it is, I'm here. He'd been in some frightening situations in the outer reaches. A debris collision that had taken out his secondary navigation array. a fuel miscalculation that had left him drifting for 18 hours before a passing freighter spotted his emergency beacon, a contract dispute with a Teshari mining operation that had gotten briefly physical before the station security intervened. In every one of those situations, Patches had been there. In the debris collision, she'd wedged herself under the navigator's console and ridden out the hull vibration without making a sound. In the fuel crisis, she'd slept pressed against his side during the long, cold hours of the drift, her body heat measurably helping to compensate for the reduced life support. In the confrontation with the Teshari foreman, she'd stood at Cale's knee and looked at the alien with her odd mismatched eyes with an expression of calm, focused attention that had genuinely made the foreman hesitate. Dogs read the room. They always have. It's what they were shaped to do. 10,000 years of sharing fire and shelter with humans, learning to read human faces and human energy and human intention better than any other creature on Earth. Patches read the room. She read Cale. He loved her in the way that humans love the things that have been present for all of it, the good years and the bad years, the lonely hours and the occasional moments of genuine wonder, the entire continuous experience of a life lived mostly away from other people. Completely, without reservation, without condition, the station had a small outside area, technically a pressurized observation deck, but someone had filled it with imported soil and planted grass, actual grass, soft and green and ridiculous in the middle of space. It was a Teshari cultural contribution, the station's information board explained, a gesture toward the kind of planetary environments they found calming. Most of the non-Teshari residents of Meridian's Cradle used it as a recreational area. Some people brought chairs and sat in it and looked at the grass the way you look at something you didn't know you missed until you were standing in front of it. Cale brought Patches there every morning and every evening. She would spend 15 minutes investigating the grass with her nose, moving in slow, expanding circles the way she always investigated new things, building a complete picture of the area through smell before she was satisfied enough to sit down and watch the stars through the observation dome above. He would sit beside her, sometimes with a coffee, sometimes just sitting, and they would watch the stars together. It was the best part of his day. It had been the best part of his day for 7 years. The Volkai arrived at Meridian's Cradle on a Tuesday. Not that days of the week mean anything out here. Stations use standardized universal time, and the concepts of Monday and Tuesday are more psychological than practical when you're in the void. But Cale's log recorded the timestamp in Earth relative notation out of habit, and it was a Tuesday. He was in the station's main market corridor when the Volkai docked, 3 ships coming in simultaneously at the outer rings, which was the kind of arrival that makes station security check their emergency protocols, and then decide not to do anything about it because the Volkai were carrying weapons and everyone had heard the stories. The Volkai Syndicate. Let me tell you about them. They were old. Old by galactic standards, which means something different than old by human standards. Their species, the Volkai proper, the biological beings at the center of the syndicate, had been spacefaring for approximately 12,000 years. They'd built an empire in the early expansion era, lost it in a series of wars with the Teshari collective that the history books called the Fracture Conflicts, and emerged from those wars as something between pirates and mercenaries, and a culture in mourning for what they'd once been. They were tall, nearly 2.5 meters on average, with elongated limbs and narrow torsos and faces that humans tended to describe as insectoid, though the Volkai themselves found that comparison offensive. Their skin was a mottled gray-green that shifted subtly in different light conditions, almost like a slow, passive camouflage. They had 4 eyes arranged in a slight arc across their foreheads, each eye moving somewhat independently, which gave them an excellent field of vision and an unsettling appearance to species that had evolved with forward-facing eyes. They were dangerous. This was acknowledged by everyone. The Galactic Council had a standing designation for the Volkai Syndicate under the terms of the Outer Reaches Governance Compact, A persistent threat entity, which was bureaucratic language for we know they're pirates and we can't stop them, and we've decided the best we can do is monitor them. They raided shipping lanes. They extracted transit fees from vessels passing through their claimed territories. They occasionally took hostages for ransom, though they were generally reliable about releasing hostages once paid, which kept the situation from escalating to the kind of active military response that might actually threaten them. They were ruthless, but they weren't stupid. They operated within a system of calculated brutality that kept them dangerous without making them a target that the major galactic powers felt obligated to eliminate. They had, in short, found the exact line between feared and extinct, and walked it with a 12,000-year-old precision, until Kale Doran's dog. He was buying supplies in the market corridor when the Volkai came through. There were about 12 of them in the group that moved through the main market scouting party, or maybe just the ones who wanted to see what the station had to offer. They moved with the particular kind of swagger that comes from knowing that everyone around you is afraid of you, that particular loose-limbed confidence of beings who have never had to calculate whether they could take someone in a fight because the answer has always been yes. The market vendors went quiet as they passed. Not silent. There was still noise, still the background hum of commerce, but quieter. That specific quieter that means everyone is watching without looking like they're watching. Kale was at a supply kiosk near the far end of the corridor, loading canine nutrition packs and water filters onto a cart. He noticed the Volkai. He noted them the way you note potential weather assessed, filed, kept in peripheral awareness. He wasn't afraid exactly. He'd encountered Volkai before, at other stations, in other contexts. As long as you didn't have anything they wanted, they generally ignored you. He had Patches on a lead. She was sitting beside the cart with the particular patience of a dog who has learned that supply runs end eventually, and then something more interesting happens. She was watching the corridor with her mismatched eyes, relaxed, her tail doing its slow propeller rotation at a leisurely pace. The Volkai group came level with his kiosk. One of them, the one walking slightly ahead of the others, which Kale would later identify from station security footage as a mid-rank enforcer named Crave of the Void, which was the kind of name the Volkai gave their people, looked down, saw Patches, stopped. What happened next took approximately 11 seconds. Later, Kale would go over station security footage of those 11 seconds so many times that he could narrate them with his eyes closed. The Volkai enforcer stopped, looked at Patches with that four-eyed sweep of alien attention, said something in Volkai that the station translation system didn't immediately render too fast, too colloquial, reached out with one of those long gray-green limbs, not to pet her. The reach wasn't exploratory or curious. It was possessive. The kind of reach that says, I want to see what that is and I will pick it up to find out. Patches, who had spent 7 years reading the room, immediately understood that something was wrong. She backed away, put herself behind Kale's legs. Made a sound that wasn't quite a growl, too quiet for that, too low, just a sub-vocal rumble of no, not that. No, Kale moved his hand to the lead. Hey, he said. Standard interspecies boundary language delivered calmly. Don't touch her. The enforcer looked at him. All 4 eyes, independently, each one landing on a different part of Kale's face and body in that disconcerting Volkai way. The translation came through his earpiece 3 seconds later. Quiet, pray thing. Kale said nothing. Patches pressed closer against his legs. The enforcer reached again, faster this time, and Patches, 7 years of trust, 7 years of knowing what safety felt like, 7 years of a man who had never once let anything hurt her, tried to move further away, and the lead pulled taut, and the enforcer's hand closed around her. Not around her body. Around her neck. What the Volkai enforcer did in the next 4 seconds, Kale spent the rest of his life not describing in detail to anyone. What he told the Galactic Council investigator later, in a voice that was very quiet and very flat and very controlled, was that it was quick. That Patches didn't suffer longer than those 4 seconds. That was all he ever said about those 4 seconds. He never said it again. The enforcer dropped her, looked at the thing in his hand, looked at what he'd done, with the particular Voakai expression that station behavioral logs would later identify as mild surprise at a fragile object's fragility. Not guilt, not horror. Not even satisfaction, just mild surprise. Then he made a sound that the translation system rendered as something between a dismissive exhale and a low chuckle, and he kept walking. The rest of the group kept walking. The market corridor was silent. Cale stood. He didn't move for a very long time. Around him, the market very slowly, very carefully returned to its business, because that is what markets do, and because no one wanted to be adjacent to whatever was about to happen. The supply kiosk operator, a Teshari female with copper skin and the wide lateral eyes of her species, watched Cale with an expression that the Teshari display for witnessing something terrible and not knowing what your role in it is. Cale knelt down. He picked Patches up. He held her against his chest the way he had held her when she was a puppy and frightened by a strange sound, firmly, carefully, like something precious. He stood up. He walked back to his ship. He sat in the forward cabin for 6 hours. That's what the ship's log shows. 6 hours of no system activity, no navigation queries, no communications, no external sensors active. Just a human and a dog in a docked ship in the dark. What he was doing in those 6 hours, nobody knows. He never talked about it. The ship's internal log doesn't record anything except environmental data, temperature, oxygen levels, the basic background hum of a vessel at rest. What we know is what happened when the 6 hours ended. He laid Patches down carefully on her blanket in the forward cabin. The blanket she always slept on. He arranged it the way she liked it, bunched slightly at the edges, forming a kind of low nest. He put her on it the way he put her on it every night, in the position she always slept in, curled slightly to the left. He stood there for a moment. Then he went to the ship's equipment locker. He took out his survey equipment. The geological scanner, the deep-range sensor array, the long-distance drone package. Tools of a legitimate trade, all of them. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would cause a manifest scanner to flag them. Then he went to a second locker, the one that wasn't on the official manifest, and he took out the things he'd accumulated over 8 years of working in the outer reaches, where there was no council protection and no cavalry coming, and the only thing between you and whatever the void contained was what you'd prepared for. He sat down at his navigation console. He pulled up everything in the station's public database on the Voakai Syndicate. He read for 2 hours. Then he sent a message. The message went to a contact named Sira Voss, who had been Cale's supervisor at the Colonial Survey Corps and was now, in a capacity she didn't officially discuss, working for something the Corps called the Outer Reaches Coordination Office. Which was the kind of name that tells you it's not really about coordination. The message was short. Sira, I need everything you have on Voakai Syndicate operations in the Cash and Drift sector. Command structure, patrol routes, station dependencies, anything flagged in the last 18 months. I'll explain when I see you. KPS Patches is gone. He knew that Sira would understand what that meant. He knew she would understand the sequence, the information request, and then that 3-word postscript, and what the combination of those 2 things implied. He knew because Sira Voss had met Patches, had scratched her behind the ears and laughed when Patches had put her head in Sira's lap with an expression of absolute confidence that this was her right. Had said, God, Cale, she's something else. He knew Sira would understand. The response came in 40 minutes, files attached. Cale, I have to say this once and then I'll never say it again. Be careful, not for yourself. You're going to do what you're going to do. Be careful because Patches wouldn't want you to disappear out there. She always wanted you to come home. The Syndicate's main operations hub in your sector is a converted mining platform called the Voakai's Reach. Coordinates attached. It's not a small installation. Come home. Cale read the message twice. He opened the attached files. He started planning. Part 2. What humans DOBUILDTENSIONI want to stop here for a moment and tell you something about the Galactic Council's Xenopsychology Division, because it's relevant to what comes next. The Council's Xenopsychology Division has been studying humans since first contact. which happened approximately 90 years before the events of this story. In 90 years, they've produced an enormous body of research, thousands of papers, hundreds of field studies, multiple long-form analyses, all trying to answer what they call the human anomaly. The anomaly isn't our aggression. Every species capable of reaching space has aggression. It's an evolutionary prerequisite. You don't develop the drive to expand into hostile environments without it. The anomaly isn't our intelligence. We're smart, but we're not the smartest species they've cataloged. The Teshari have us beat on raw processing speed. The Narim collective operate on a hive cognition that allows them to solve problems no individual mind could manage. The anomaly is our attachment. The xenopsychologists' papers circle around this again and again, like a puzzle they can't quite solve. Human beings form emotional bonds with other living creatures, not just their own species, not just their own families, but with animals, with places, with objects that have accumulated shared history. And the strength of those bonds doesn't correlate with the strategic value of the bonded thing. A human will risk themselves to protect something with zero survival utility, a companion animal, a photograph, a piece of music, with the same intensity they would use to protect their offspring, more sometimes. One paper, written by a Teshari researcher named Velkaris of the Third Study, put it this way: humans are the only species we have encountered whose capacity for violence scales directly with their capacity for love. The stronger the bond that has been broken, the more total the response. This is not a rational system. It has no upper limit we have been able to identify. The paper was written 15 years before the events at Meridian's cradle. The Volkai Syndicate had not read it. The constant Meridian undocked from Meridian's cradle on the morning of the third day. Station departure logs showed it as a routine survey departure, destination logged as Cashin Drift Sector 7, purpose listed as geological survey continuation, expected return 14 days. There was nothing in the manifest that would have caused a flag, nothing in the system activity that would have looked unusual. The ship left. Nobody on the station knew, at that point, what Kale had been doing in those 2 days. Later, when the council investigators went through the station's network logs, they found traces of his activity, the research queries, the communication with Sierra Voss, the detailed study of the files she'd sent. They found records of him visiting 4 separate establishments on the station in those 2 days, none of them connected by any obvious thread. The first was a machine shop in the Teshari district, where he spent 3 hours working with equipment he rented by the hour. He paid in untraceable transit credits. The second was an information broker's office near the outer docking rings, a small business run by a human who'd been in the outer reaches long enough to have contacts in places the council pretended didn't exist. The third was a communications hub, where he sent several messages under a scrambled address protocol. The fourth was a small chapel, technically a multi-faith contemplative space, the kind most large stations maintained for the various species that found such places useful. It was mostly empty when Kale was there. He sat for 2 hours. Station cameras show him sitting very still, looking at nothing, doing nothing. The council investigators noted the chapel visit in their report, but did not know what to make of it. One of them wrote a brief addendum. Subject appeared calm throughout observation period. No behavioral indicators of agitation or emotional distress. This is perhaps the most concerning detail of the entire pre-incident profile. The constant Meridian crossed the outer edge of the Cashin Drift and kept going. On the navigation console, where the survey route coordinates should have been, there were different coordinates. The coordinates Sierra Voss had sent. Kale flew in silence. He had a playlist that he usually played on long transits, human music, mostly older stuff, the kind that had survived 4 centuries of cultural evolution, because it turned out to be genuinely good. He didn't play it this transit. He flew in silence, with the background hum of the ship's drives and the soft ambient sound of the environmental systems. Patches wasn't in the forward cabin. He'd put her in the small cargo hold before he left, wrapped in her blanket, arranged carefully. He'd left the hold temperature set to comfortable, which was irrational, which he knew was irrational. It didn't matter. He'd done it anyway. The hold temperature was set to comfortable. He flew for 36 hours. The Volkai's reach was not, as the name suggested, a single installation. The files Sierra had sent explained it in careful detail. She'd been thorough, because Sierra Voss was always thorough. It was the thing about her that had made her a good supervisor and probably made her an effective whatever she was now. The Reach was a converted tertiary mining platform that the Volkai had seized during the Second Fracture conflict and never given back, expanded over the centuries into a sprawling installation that served as the central logistics hub for their cache and drift operations. 3 connected habitat rings, 2 heavy weapons platforms, an internal docking facility that could accommodate up to 40 ships, and a population of somewhere between 800 and 1,200 Volkai. The estimates varied because the Council's intelligence on the internal layout was, Sierra noted with a kind of dry precision that Kale recognized as her version of admitting a limitation, incomplete. What they did know, the Reach was defended. Not military grade, because the Volkai operated below the threshold that would provoke a military response, but defended. Hull-mounted weapons platforms, a small patrol wing of 4 to 6 fighter-class vessels, internal security forces. Against a single survey vessel with a 1-person crew, those defenses were complete overkill. Against whatever Kale Doran had become in 6 hours of sitting with patches in the dark, the situation was more complicated. I need to tell you about something called a deep-range survey drone. In legitimate survey work, deep-range drones are used to map terrain, planetary surfaces, asteroid fields, debris clouds, in detail that a ship's sensors can't achieve from a safe distance. They're small, roughly half a meter across, built to be nearly undetectable to standard sensor arrays, because the whole point is that they need to fly through unstable environments without alerting whatever geological processes might affect them. Kale had 12 of them. What he'd done in that tertiary machine shop for 3 hours was modify 6 of them in ways that the Outer Reaches Coordination Office's files had suggested were possible, using components that were individually legal and collectively concerning. What he'd bought from the information broker wasn't information. It was software, a specific navigation package that, Sierra's files had noted, was used by a subset of Outer Reaches operators who needed their vessels to behave in ways that standard navigation AIs weren't programmed to allow. The communication messages he'd sent from the scrambled address had gone to 3 recipients. 2 of them were former Colonial Survey Corps colleagues. One of them was someone whose name didn't appear in any public records that the Council investigators were able to locate. All 3 had responded. He came out of the debris field at minimum drive output, barely enough to maintain course, the kind of power signature a piece of drifting debris might produce if it had gotten lucky with its trajectory. The Reach's sensor arrays, calibrated for the drive signatures of ships, for energy weapons, for the specific electromagnetic profiles of vessels in motion, didn't flag him. He drifted. He watched. He waited. The Reach was lit from the inside, its habitat rings glowing with the blue-white light that Volkai installations used, their species having evolved in environments where that particular wavelength was comfortable. From the outside in the dark it looked almost beautiful, a constructed thing glowing quietly in the void, which was, Kale thought, what all ships looked like from a distance. Beautiful and small and vulnerable in all that dark. He wasn't there to think about beauty. He deployed the survey drones. They went dark immediately, a feature of the modifications, all radio signature suppressed, running on a closed-loop passive system that didn't broadcast. They spread out slowly, each taking a different vector toward the Reach, each following a navigation path that Kale had plotted by hand over 36 hours of transit. He waited. The first message he sent to the Reach came through on a civilian frequency, unencrypted, in standard galactic trade language, Volkai's Reach. This is the survey vessel Constant Meridian. Request permission to dock for emergency resupply. Navigation systems damaged in debris field collision. We are not a threat and are not carrying anything of value. Please respond. The we was a deliberate choice. He wanted them to think there was more than one person on the ship. The response took 4 minutes. When it came, it was in Volkai with a translation appended, standard practice for stations that dealt with multiple species, though the tone of the translation was rougher than a professional system would produce, which suggested they were running a budget translation package. The message said, "Civilian vessel. You are in Volkai-claimed space. Transit fee for passage or docking is 300 standard units plus inspection fee. Prepare to receive boarding party." Kale replied immediately, "Understood. We will comply with all requirements. Be aware our onboard life support has been compromised. We have a minor oxygen processing fault that is non-critical, but I mention it only to explain any unusual atmospheric readings your boarding party may detect. Happy to explain and show documentation when you arrive." He had no oxygen processing fault. He was running a small targeted chemical release into the ship's atmosphere, a compound that, in the outer reaches, was sometimes used by survey crews as a chemical deterrent against certain types of aggressive fauna encountered on planetary surfaces. In small quantities, in a contained space, it was unpleasant. In the concentrations Kale was building up in the ship's forward sections, it would incapacitate most known species in under 30 seconds. He pressurized the forward airlock. He waited for the boarding party. The boarding party was 5 Volkai, which was more than he'd planned for, and exactly what the information broker had suggested was standard for a small civilian vessel. They came through his airlock with the efficient arrogance of beings who had done this many times, and the first 2 were incapacitated before the third fully cleared the seal, and the situation resolved itself in under 45 seconds. Nobody died. Kale had been precise about that. He needed them conscious. That was the whole point. Climax here is where the story becomes something that the council investigators would later describe as without precedent in any documented interaction involving a human actor in the outer reaches or within council-monitored space. Which is a very careful way of saying that nobody had ever seen anything like what Kale Doran did next. He had 5 Volkai Syndicate operatives secured in his cargo hold, which meant he was in the hold where he'd put patches. He stood there for a moment. He looked at the blanket in the corner. Then he turned to the secured Volkai and he spoke in the calm, flat, very controlled voice that the coordination office would later flag in their psychological profile as the primary behavioral indicator that should have triggered an immediate intervention alert. "I'm going to tell you what's going to happen," he said. "I'm going to release 4 of you. You are going to go back to your reach, and you are going to tell whoever is in command that the Constant Meridian is requesting a meeting. Full command staff. In person. You will tell them that the human aboard this vessel is not a threat and is not making demands. He is making a request." One of the Volkai, the ranking one, identifiable by the status markers on his harness, said something in Volkai. The translation earpiece rendered it as, "You are making a serious mistake, Prathing." "I know what I look like to you," Kale said. "Single ship, 1 person, non-military vessel. Nothing in my manifest that should concern you. I understand why you think this is simple." He paused. "Tell them the name of the enforcer who was at Meridian's cradle 3 days ago. Tell them what he did there. Tell them the human aboard this vessel knows that name and that human is asking for a meeting." Another pause. "Tell them I'm patient. I've been patient for 3 days. I can be patient longer." He released 4 of them. He kept 1, not roughly, not harshly. He provided the remaining Volkai with water, a diplomatic gesture that the Volkai, having dealt with many species over 12,000 years, recognized as a statement of intent toward non-aggression. He sat down across the hold from the secured operative and he waited. The 4 Volkai went back to the Reach. Response from the Reach command took 2 hours. 2 hours of Kale sitting in his cargo hold, across from a Volkai operative, in silence. At some point during those 2 hours, the Volkai operative would later describe this to the council investigators with an expression that the Teshari translator struggled to render but eventually classified as disquiet. Kale got up, went to the corner and straightened the blanket. Just straightened it. Carefully. With both hands, then sat back down. The operative said nothing. Kale said nothing. They waited. The command staff of the Volkai's Reach did not come out to meet him. They sent a message, instead a formal one in proper translation, which was a signal that they were taking this seriously. It said, "The Reach acknowledges your communication. What is your request, human vessel?" Kale recorded his response carefully. He spoke in a measured pace, clearly, so that the translation systems would have no difficulty. 3 days ago at Meridian's Cradle Station, one of your people killed a dog. The dog was mine. Her name was Patches. She was 7 years old. She had never hurt anyone or anything in her life. Your enforcer, his designation is Crave of the Void, and I would like you to confirm that you know this name, killed her in 11 seconds in a public market corridor, because she moved away from him. He paused. I am not here to demand credits. I'm not here to make threats. I'm here to make you understand something, and I want to be very clear about this, because I think there has been a misunderstanding between your species and mine that has gone unaddressed for too long. He looked directly at the recording sensor. We attach to things. Humans do. We attach to places and animals and each other in ways that are not strategic and not rational and not negotiable. And when those things are taken from us, not in war, not in conflict, not because someone was trying to hurt us, but carelessly because someone thought we didn't matter enough to ask first. He stopped. He breathed. Your enforcer looked at Patches like she was a thing he'd picked up off a shelf, Kale said quietly. He looked at me like I was something he'd have to step around on his way out, and then he kept walking. And your syndicate, your entire apparatus, 12,000 years of it, has been operating in this sector under the assumption that this is acceptable. That the species you move through are things to be processed, transit fees and inspections and maintained threat assessments, calculations. Another pause. I want Crave of the Void delivered to me. I want him delivered to me alive and unharmed, and I want a meeting with whoever authorized that patrol to Meridian's Cradle. He ended the recording. He sent it. The response took 6 minutes. Human vessel. The syndicate does not surrender its people to anyone. If you continue to make demands in Volkai space, the consequences will be yours to bear. Kale read the response. He opened a different channel. Okay, he said. He sent a single short burst signal on a frequency that the Reach's sensors had not flagged because it was in a band the Volkai didn't use for military communications. On the Reach, things started to happen. Here I have to stop and explain something. In those 2 days at Meridian's Cradle, the 3 messages Kale sent had gone to 3 people. 2 of them were former Survey Corps colleagues, people who had worked the outer reaches for years and accumulated, as people who work the outer reaches tend to do, a particular set of skills and contacts that don't appear on any official record. One of them, a woman named Taris Paul, had spent 6 years charting Volkai patrol corridors as part of an unofficial network of survey operators who shared navigational data, because knowing where the Volkai weren't was worth money. The other, a man Kale had known for 12 years named Brecht Aslan, had a different specialty. He was the person you called when you needed to understand how something was built, because Brecht had an engineer's mind and a collector's habit of noting details, and he had been through 3 Volkai installations in his career, and had documented every one of them in the careful private journals he kept out of what he called professional appreciation for structural choices. The third message had gone to someone who, as I mentioned, doesn't appear in any public records. What happened on the Reach when Kale sent that signal was, and here I am working from the Council's classified incident report, which Sierra Voss may or may not have provided access to in a capacity she technically wasn't supposed to have, simultaneous. The Reach's internal communication system went dark. Not offline. It was still running. The systems were still active. But the command communications, the encrypted channels that the Reach's leadership used to coordinate their security response, were suddenly running through a routing layer they hadn't installed and couldn't identify. Everything they said, every order issued, every tactical decision made in the next 4 hours was being heard. The patrol wing that launched to intercept the constant meridian flew directly into the survey drones Kale had pre-positioned over 36 hours of patient geometry. Drones that had been sitting dark and motionless in trajectories the patrol wing would pass through. And what happened then was not an explosion. The modified drones weren't weapons in any conventional sense. But the patrol wing's navigation systems experienced a cascading error that grounded 4 of the 6 fighters before they'd cleared the Reach's immediate airspace. The weapons platforms that tracked the constant meridian received targeting solutions from their own guidance systems that were mathematically precise and completely wrong, not randomly wrong, but wrong in a way that would take any competent engineer several hours to diagnose and correct. The constant meridian, meanwhile, was not where it appeared to be on the Reach's sensors. It was closer, much closer. I want to be careful here about what happened next because the Council's report is careful about it, and I think the carefulness is important. Kale Doran did not destroy the Volkai's Reach. He could have. That's what the report concludes with some discomfort, that given the disarray in the Reach's systems during those 4 hours, and the tools he had available, and the support he'd arranged, the destruction of the installation was within the range of achievable outcomes. He didn't do it. What he did was fly the constant meridian to the Reach's primary docking approach on manual control, with no stealth, no deception, just flying his ship directly at a space station full of beings who, at this point, were thoroughly afraid of him and thoroughly unable to do anything coherent about it. And he requested docking permission. On the civilian frequency, unencrypted, Volkai's Reach, this is the constant meridian, requesting docking permission. I'd like to continue our conversation in person. There was a very long silence from the Reach then. Granted, Bay 14.